everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar, Surviving a Cyber Attack, the Importance of an Incident Response Plan. We've got a great webinar for you today, and we're really excited about it. Just a couple of quick housekeeping notes. If you have a question during the webinar, please type it into the question box on your toolbar. We will answer it at the end. This webinar is being recorded, so if you have it will be sent to you after the webinar is over, and also if you would like to access it, we will be posting it up on our website. And without any further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Paul.
Thanks, Robin, and thanks everybody for attending this webinar. We're going to be talking about incident response plans and why they're such an important thing to be doing. I do want to start this by saying that surviving a cyber attack is possible. But it requires a little bit of advanced planning, and effectively that's going to be the thesis today, is that an ounce of prevention really is truly worth the pound of cure in this case. And the more time you spend in preparation for a cyber attack, the less time you'll spend recovering and responding from it. So with that, let's move in. So I'm Paul Caiazzo. I'm co-founder and chief security architect of TruShield Security Solutions. I've got about 15 to actually probably about 17 years of experience in cybersecurity. I'd ask anybody out in the audience to connect with me on either Twitter or LinkedIn, or shoot me an email if you have a question about anything we're going to talk about today. I'm always open to answering any questions about cybersecurity, and additionally, connecting with me on LinkedIn gets you access to some of our threat intelligence reports, which we publish pretty frequently. So please feel free to reach out there. TruShield, the company that we started in 2008, it's based here in the Washington, D.C. area. Our key focuses are really in two main stacks. One, professional services, through which we do compromise assessments, penetration tests, incident response, vulnerability assessments, risk assessments, things like that. And then our managed services arm, where we do 24/7 threat monitoring and also incident response services under there as well. We operate in a number of industries, including the federal government, the financial industry, the legal industry, healthcare industry, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's actually really beneficial for our clients, especially in an incident response sort of engagement, because we've seen threats across a very wide spectrum of attack vectors that maybe aren't going to be focused on attacking financial institutions today, but could in the future, or not focused on governments today, but could in the future, et cetera. And having that breadth of experience across many different types of incidents helps us move efficiently, act tactically when those incidents do happen, and minimize the containment and eradication times. And that's really what we're going to be trying to help you guys do today, is minimize the amount of time and effort that it takes to contain and respond to an actual cyber incident. So the agenda that we're going to talk to today, first off, you are right to be worried. I hate to deliver the message like that, but you really should be worried about this stuff, because it's pretty bad out there, and that's really only going to get worse. Again, an ounce of prevention is going to help prevent a lot of the incidents from actually occurring in your network, and then also set you up for timely containment and response when it actually does happen. And that is the worst case scenario. What do you do when you've been popped, or when some piece of malware is operating on your network? What do you do? And we're going to talk through some of that too. And we're also going to talk through the importance of lessons learned, and why it's so important to take a look back at what just happened, so that we can better prepare ourselves for the next time. So diving right in, you are right to be worried. It isn't if, but when. I kind of it's a little bittersweet for me to deliver this message. Obviously, from a business perspective, the number of high-profile cyber incidents and data breaches helps TruShield from a business perspective, but it doesn't help from an overall industry perspective, in that I don't personally like to see major data breaches occur. Personally, they've affected me. I know that they've affected some of our employees in the past. They've affected probably many people out in the audience right now. So it really is just a matter of when it happens to you as a business entity. It doesn't matter how much how much money you're spending on it. The icons on the screen spend huge amounts of money on cybersecurity. Target spends millions and millions of dollars in cybersecurity, and is still one of the biggest data breaches in history. The TJX companies spent huge amounts on cybersecurity, and then spent way, way more than that on incident response after that major, major data breach. Office of Personnel and Management also had a significant cyber budget that had a major data breach that actually set back some national security strategy a little bit with respect to the amount of personally identifiable information that was exposed. Every one of these organizations on the screen has both budget and mandate to actually do cybersecurity, whether that's through PCI requirements or FISMA requirements or HIPAA requirements for some of the healthcare providers up there. They all had some compliance mandate that they had to meet in order to actually operate. And I guess the bottom line here is that nobody's perfect. Really, every one of these organizations, they failed, and they only really need to fail once in order for literally the worst thing to happen. The thing that separates the good from the bad in this case is the amount of time it takes to learn that something has happened on your network and then act to quickly contain and respond to it. And unfortunately there, again, the statistics aren't really, they don't shine a very good light on the industry as a whole. It takes about 210 days for an organization to realize that they've had a data breach. So that's 7 months. If you think about the type of damage that an attacker can do within your environment for 7 months, it's pretty comprehensive at that point. I generally try to tell our clients that if they've had a data breach go undetected for the industry average, they can simply expect any PII or PHI or other sensitive information on their network was stolen during that time. It's pretty much after 7 months that any kind of concerted attack or sophisticated attacker would be able to do effectively anything in your network if given that amount of time. The other bad things about this is that 4 out of 5, it's actually, I think it's 19% of organizations are actually able to detect it themselves. Usually they have to wait for somebody like law enforcement or some third party to tell them that there's indicators of compromise streaming out of their network. So what actually happens there is an attacker targets ABC Bank on day 1, and ABC Bank doesn't learn about that compromise until 210 days later. In the interim there, in that intervening 7 months, the attackers that have access to ABC Bank are using that access to fan out and attack other organizations by virtue of the internet access that ABC Bank has. And those other organizations may be more able to detect that compromise themselves, or maybe are watching traffic more closely, or are already involved with some law enforcement organization investigation, and they see indicators coming from your network. So your IP space is showing like malicious traffic, or some command and control server is talking to a machine on your environment. And that's a lot of times, in fact 4 out of 5 times, how organizations are informed that they've been compromised, not even through their own detective controls. And that's kind of the worst case scenario, because at that point, it's not just that your own controls didn't work, but somebody outside the organization had to kind of give you a black eye, and there's a little bit of egg on your face when you have to tell your management or the board that the FBI let us know that we had a major data breach. And then you have to also tell them that, hey, the average cost of cleaning up this data breach is about $3.8 million to a US-based company. And most organizations aren't spending that kind of money on cybersecurity. And so if you're not, and you do have a major data breach, you can kind of look at that as a potential loss or a cost that you could need to budget for in the event that there is an actual cyber breach. Now, cyber insurance can cover some amount of that breach cost, and we'll talk about that in a little while. It's definitely a requirement at this point to have some cyber insurance policy, but there are still some certain things that you need to do with respect to preparing yourself in order for your claim to actually be accepted and not just denied. Less than 10% of organizations are satisfied with the current incident response capabilities. So what that means is that 90% of the world has looked at what they're doing from a cyber perspective and from an incident response perspective, and did an honest self-assessment of how well they're positioned to be able to fight off a concerted attack, or how well they'd be able to recover from an incident were one to occur. And that's abysmal, right? So less than 10% of organizations feel like they've got it well enough sorted to be able to handle what comes at them. The vast majority of the world doesn't. And that's why, really, since all these capabilities go hand in hand, that's why it takes 210 days to discover that incidents have occurred, because the entire program of controls that support the cybersecurity initiative as a whole aren't working together, and they really need to be in order to have an effective cyber strategy at kind of a holistic level there. So let's talk about that cybersecurity strategy at a holistic level. It's truly the case that when it comes to incident response, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. It's probably worth something more like a ton of cure, because if you've done a good job with respect to the 4 different capability areas we're going to discuss, then you may prevent the vast majority of incidents from actually happening. You'll be able to quickly detect them when they do happen. You'll be able to contain them, most importantly, and then you'll be able to much more easily eradicate them. So what does a good cybersecurity strategy look like? We group it into these 4 categories because this represents the 4 main capabilities that need to be implemented in order to really secure an organization from end to end. Now, when you look at this puzzle of prevention, detection, containment, and eradication, you're probably thinking to yourself, well, there's a lot of technical controls in there, but there's not really much with respect to policies or planning or things like that. But in fact, there really is. Every one of these puzzle pieces, there's a whole stack of important capabilities that fall underneath. There are important things to be thinking about in each of them. You've got things like policies and regulations that are influencing every one of these. But each one of these has some very necessary controls that must be implemented correctly in order for you to be able to protect yourselves. So let's talk about those. First off, prevention. So there's a bunch of things that go into a good prevention strategy. I always try to emphasize this based upon a couple of core cybersecurity concepts. Those concepts are the concept of least privilege, least functionality, and need to know. And if you get those 3 right, then you probably have done a fair job of prevention. So least privilege means configuring your devices so that they can so that they're only accessible by the people that absolutely need to be able to use them to support their job function. They should people should have as little privilege as they possibly can. Users should not have administrative access to their desktops, for instance. People shouldn't have access to servers except for perhaps systems administrators, things like that. What that does for you is when a user is targeted via something like a phishing attack and they accidentally click a link, that's going to limit the scope of that potential compromise to effectively just the stuff that that user has access to. And so if that user has administrative access over that box that they're logged into, their desktop or laptop, then you can safely assume that the attackers have gained control over that device. If that user just has regular user account access, it's very likely that the attacker won't be able to take over that device. And even more so, if that user doesn't have access to sensitive servers that contain PII databases and things like that, then the attacker who's compromised that user is not going to be able to even see that that stuff exists. And so that's really important right there from preventing a data breach perspective is least privilege. Least functionality is a very similar concept, more focused on the device than the user. So least functionality means I've done things like I've locked my firewall down to the very minimum ports and protocols that I need to support my business. I've configured my servers and my desktops with some hardened configuration baseline. I have a good application inventory and device inventory, and I'm limiting the types of applications that can be installed on the devices in my environment, et cetera. And what you're doing there is minimizing your risk surface, similarly to how you would do that with the least privilege concept. You're minimizing the number of ways that a bad guy can compromise a machine. And that's going to, again, help prevent the vast majority of stuff from happening to you. It won't prevent all of it, which is why you need the rest of this stuff. Need to know is another one where even if a particular user in your environment has level of clearance sufficient for a particular type of information, but doesn't have really a need to have access to that information in order to do their job, then don't give it to them. Again, the fewer access points to information that are available to a bad guy, the better. And those 3 core concepts really influence all of the rest of this stuff. Yeah, there are definitely technical controls that go into prevention. Things like firewalls, intrusion prevention systems, encryption and antivirus are all absolutely critical for prevention. But ultimately, if you understand those 3 concepts, least privilege, least functionality, and need to know, and implement them properly in your environment, then you've done a pretty good job of adequately addressing the prevention component of the cybersecurity program. But what happens when you got it wrong once? Out of that million times, the bad guy got it right once. Well, then you've got to move to detection. You've got to be able to detect that something bad has happened as quickly as you possibly can. And this is super important. The amount of time it takes to detect an incident really is what's going to distinguish a simple malware infection on one device to a major data breach that you've got to go out and notify clients and partners and things like that. So what goes into detection? Well, similarly to how you've got need to know, least privilege, and least functionality, and prevention, those actually do apply to detection as well. by configuring the devices to their absolute minimum, you're actually making it easier to monitor them because there's a smaller universe of potential traffic that you have to be looking for. Your tools need to be more tuned to your specific environment, but that's also going to make them more effective and more accurate with fewer false positives. And that's probably the biggest hurdle to overcome from a detection standpoint is how do I manage false positives? And again, doing a good job with those three concepts will help you with that. There are some technical capabilities within the detection stack that have to be there in order for you to really be able to do this job, and those include network-based IDS, a host-based IDS, and actually a lot of organizations we talk to aren't using host-based IDSs yet. That's a big risk as far as I'm concerned. If you're only looking at intrusion detection at the network level, you're going to miss a lot of stuff that's happening at the endpoint between the user and the browser or between the email gateway and the user. All that stuff happens at the endpoint, and you're going to miss it if you're just looking at your egress point. So host-based IDS is super important. Web gateway and email gateway are also really important because they're the most common attack vectors today are not trying to poke a hole through your firewall. They're trying to compromise a user's web session or email via phishing attack or something like that. And if you use things like a web gateway and email gateway, you're going to be able to block a lot of that stuff. And even if you don't block it, you're going to be able to see that that's occurring. That, again, is going to help you move into containment much more quickly. Of course, bringing all of this together into something that's usable and meaningful for both the technical staff and the executive staff is critical. There's a huge amount of data that we're talking about here. When you start looking at network-based IDS logs and host-based IDS logs, it can grow to a tremendous volume very, very quickly. And so you really need a SIEM, Security Information and Event Management Utility, to bring all that information together, mash it against a threat database or multiple threat databases, and help you pick out the needle in a haystack. The complication there is that if you're in any kind of industry that's a high-value target, so I'm thinking, federal, financial, legal, healthcare, et cetera, all of those are in the crosshairs right now, you really need to be doing monitoring 24 hours a day because the bad guys are certainly trying to attack you 24 hours a day. And even if they're only working 9 to 5, chances are if they're in China, that 9 to 5 over there is going to be the middle of the night over here, and you need to be monitoring around the clock. We see a lot of attacks come through in the middle of the night when the attackers just expect the bad guy or the good guys aren't going to be watching the walls. And unfortunately, that's really true. In a lot of these cases, even given an attacker 8 hours in your environment before you log into your SIEM and see some signature or alarm gets triggered, that could be too long. That could be the difference between a headline and deploying an instant response person to clean up a single system. So you really have to get SIEM correct. And again, my opinion, this particular puzzle piece is the one that really separates the high-functioning security programs from the paperwork security programs. Okay, so the next step is containment, and here's the thing with containment. Although it really only ever gets triggered after an incident has occurred, it's something you need to be planning for effectively from day one, because a lot of the best containment strategies are really built around network architecture. And by that I mean specifically network segmentation. And re-architecting a network that is in production can be a complicated thing. It's not impossible, and I would suggest that if you have a very flat network where your servers and your users all share the same IP space, it's worth the effort, and it will be some effort, but it's worth it to re-architect that network so that if you do have some kind of malware outbreak on the user side, it's not going to affect your sensitive data on your server side. Network segmentation is super, super important, and I can't stress that enough. The other thing that good network segmentation allows you to do is more granular monitoring, so that an effective containment strategy also helps detection. Because if you think about it, if you segment your user space from your server space, there still needs to be some channel through which traffic gets from one to the other, but it'd be very limited to the very specific types of traffic that are required. So that need to know, that least privilege and least functionality are baked into the system as a part of the architecture. What that means is there are choke points throughout the network that traffic has to pass through. And those choke points are perfect spots to do monitoring and watch for things like insider threats. Having that adequate network segmentation on the internal network is really a great way to prevent insider threats detect when a piece of malware is trying to fan out across an environment, or when an insider is trying to gain access to some device they shouldn't, and also help you lock that down. So a good example of this might be if there's a piece of malware that outbreaks in a user environment and it hasn't yet touched anything in the server environment, simply for some period of time shut that segment of the network down, or remove the connectivity between that and the server environment. Yes, it's going to take you out of production for maybe an hour or two while you clean up that piece of malware, but that's not going to fan out to your server environment and cost you days and days, potentially a lot of money to clean that up. So again, all of these are important concepts when it comes to prevention and detection, and if you do them right, it really reinforces the containment strategy as well. Port security is another technical control. If you're not familiar with that, what that effectively means is that every device that's in your environment has a MAC address or a hardware address that's associated with it, and your switches can be configured to only allow connectivity to certain or to a specific MAC address. So what that allows you to do is, let's say your antivirus finds a piece of malware on some desktop machine, and you've enabled port security, and you've got a good asset inventory with MAC addresses and stuff like that. You can look at the logs for that antivirus alarm, figure out what the MAC address is that's associated with that piece of malware, and then kill that port on your switch. And then effectively you've cut the head off of the snake, and that piece of malware can't get any further than where it is right there. So that's an important thing to do. It's kind of an advanced security step, and it really requires a couple things. First off, it requires that good network segmentation has been done. It requires you've got a good asset inventory that is up to date and current, and it requires somebody on your staff that's comfortable working with layer 2 configuration within a switch to do the port security stuff. But again, it's super important, and the better job that you do at containment, the easier you're going to have, the easier time you're going to have when it's time to move to eradication. Because simply, if you think about it, if you've contained an incident to a small subset of machines, it hasn't yet become a data breach, hasn't fanned out to a large number of machines, and it's going to take you significantly less resources to go and fix the problem. And that's really what we're trying to do with containment, is make eradication that much easier. So there's several things that go into eradication, and within eradication, I consider response and lessons learned to be part of the eradication stack. But one way or another, within eradication, there's a number of things that you've got to have in order for this to work correctly. First off, you've got to have those other three puzzle pieces: prevention, detection, and containment. But then, most importantly for this step, you've got to have a really good and tested incident response plan. And it's got to be tested. You can't just write it out one time and then put it on the shelf and forget about it. You've got to test it at least once a year, preferably more frequently than that. And the only reason I say more frequently than that is because your environment is probably pretty dynamic, and it's probably changing more frequently than your incident response plan is. And so if that's the case, then your incident response plan could very quickly become outdated. And when the worst does happen and you have to actually use it, if it's no longer accurate or reflective of the actual environment, then it's going to complicate things even more, because you're going to have to figure out what's wrong and what's right, and then it just makes it a much more difficult process to recover from an incident at that point. So tested incident response plan is super important. There are some NIST documents out there that describe a good incident response plan. There's guidance from SANS and from the TCI Council on incident response. So effectively, take a look at whatever regulatory environment you work within, and the regulator or some industry consortium has probably already done the job of what should be in an incident response plan for this type of environment. Use that as a frame of reference. Don't try to reinvent the wheel. There are certain things that are key to include in incident response plans, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. But a lot of the work has been done for you. But really, the most important part of that, again, is testing it frequently. Of course, you also need to have a backup and recovery process. If you don't have a good backup and recovery process, you're crazy at this point in time. There are so many things that can go wrong that if you don't have good backups and have a tested restoration recovery procedure, then you're asking for trouble. Because even if it isn't a cyber incident, let's say a hard drive fails, that's still an incident that you got to recover from, and that might include restoring from backup. So I'm just going to assume everybody in the audience has a good backup and recovery process, that you are actively testing and you're ensuring you can restore stuff on a regular basis. Also, at the endpoint level, you need to have some anti-malware and antivirus applications that are able to do things like quarantine and eradication at the endpoint itself. Those are super important. I obviously highly recommend that you guys do that from a centralized standpoint. So use some centrally managed tool to do this rather than rely upon something that will, quote unquote, automatically go and do what it needs to do, without any sort of central administration or central guidance. Not the best way to go about doing it, and it's hard to keep signatures up to date and things like that if you're not using some centrally managed application. And then lastly on here, incident response retainer. So this is very useful for most organizations because incident response, when something like a piece of malware has gained a foothold and you have had a data breach, there are some very specific kind of niche skills and tools that are required to do things like chain of custody and investigations of incidents in support of prosecution and things like that. That's not really within the skill set of most organizations in-house IT staff. So what we typically recommend is people, our clients, purchase an incident response retainer, from some provider. It doesn't have to be us. That retainer will basically give you a bucket of hours that you can execute if you have an incident in your environment over the course of the year or the covered period, so that you have somebody on hand in the event something happens that can come on site within 24 hours and help you start cleaning up. In some cases, you can actually have a much faster response time as well. Depends upon the company you're working with and where you're located. But it's really important to have access to that because you don't want to try to negotiate that after an incident has occurred, because that's really when time is of the essence. So again, this is where prevention really comes in super handy. Have had this stuff already in place before the incident occurs. And if you're in the middle of an incident right now trying to figure out what to do, I'm sorry, but a lot of this stuff you should have thought about a couple of months ago. So if you haven't had an incident yet, please start working on this stuff right now. Get all this preparation stuff taken care of before the worst does happen. So that incident response plan, again, there's a number of steps or sections of this document that you need to be planning for. And those include preparation, identification, containment, eradication, recovery, and analysis. And we talked through the majority of this stuff. The preparation item there is really everything we just described. Setting your program up correctly, having had put together the pieces that provide that holistic coverage of your environment so that you're preventing what you can, you're detecting what you can't prevent, you're containing that, and then you're getting it off of your system as quickly as you can. That's super important. And that's really all in that preparation phase where you're doing things like insurance, contracts, and IR retainers and things like that. Identification, so that's effectively when your IR team is engaged to determine whether or not it is actually a security incident. So that detection stack of capabilities we talked about earlier, that's really what we're talking about there. Can we identify or detect that some incident has occurred on the network? And then the instant that we do, we need to move into containment. And containment is, again, how far is that problem spread? What's the full scope of the problem? Can I eliminate the potential further spread of it by disconnecting devices or by shutting down a segment of the network, or even by quarantining a folder in my antivirus application or something like that, some sort of containment strategy. That's when that gets executed because, again, that's going to simplify eradication and recovery. And eradication is when the IR team needs to look at what specific steps we need to take to cure the problem. First and foremost, cure the problem, and then secondly, determine the root cause of it and prevent it from happening again is ultimately what we're trying to do there. Get it off my system and then figure out why it happened in the first place so that I can ensure it doesn't happen again. Recovery is, so we've cured the problem. We're now at a clean state, but I've got to get back to full operations, full operating capability, which might mean that you have to restore some stuff from backup, might mean you need to bring segments of the network back online, things like that. Usually you're going to be engaged with like a network operations team or your system administrators during recovery. Again, a lot of times that's going to exercise your backup and restore routines. So again, that's why security needs to be really involved and concerned about backups. And then the analysis phase really is about lessons learned. It's about taking a look at the incident, learning about what happened to cause the incident in the first place, and then as kind of an ancillary focus, how well the IR plan helped solve the problem. Were there any missteps during incident response that we can learn from, things along those lines? That's all in that analysis phase. Of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about cybersecurity insurance. It's at this point a necessity simply because it's again a matter of when, not if, there's going to be a data breach, or hopefully not a data breach, but at least a security incident. If there is a data breach, what cyber insurance I've seen help most often with is cover things like cost of notification, especially for mandatory notifications, where if you're in a regulated industry that has some mandatory requirement to notify clients when there's a data breach, cyber insurance can usually cover some of that, maybe not all of it, depending on the scope of the compromise. But again, the cyber insurance is, I've seen several claims rejected recently because of negligence in the security program, which is why it's so important to make sure that you're doing the homework with respect to setting yourselves up for success, and you know, because that's going to help not just remove the need to execute your insurance policy, but it's going to help protect your assets. It's going to help you comply with your regulatory requirements. In a lot of cases, it's going to enable business for you as well. But if the worst should happen, what do you actually do? Of course, you always want to hope for the best, prepare for the worst by doing all the stuff we talked about right there. But what happens if, right? What happens if we actually are compromised? Well, first off, don't panic. Really, it's true. Nobody's perfect. Nobody's going to get this right 100% of the time, which is why we keep stressing that it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. So don't feel necessarily like you personally failed. You've done your job with prevention and detection, and hopefully containment and response are well enough set up that you can execute swiftly. Now is not the time to panic. Now is the time to execute the incident response plan. So what does that actually mean? So first and foremost, you need to act swiftly. I've seen organizations stumble through the initial steps of incident response, and that has cost them millions of dollars, where what would have been a relatively simple exercise to contain a malware outbreak, fanned out to thousands of machines and cost literally millions of dollars to clean up. Had the incident response plan been executed more effectively, more efficiently, then that probably wouldn't have happened. And I'll dive into that example in a few minutes here. But if I get asked sometimes, what's the most important part of incident response? And it really boils down to one thing for me: communication. It's the absolute most important aspect of any good incident response plan. That communication matrix, which should be in every single incident response plan of all the audience members that are listening to this today, is so important. Once an impact has been identified, we need to start communicating. When we determine it's not a false positive, there needs to be notifications out to the appropriate stakeholders throughout the organization, on the operations side of the house, on the customer-facing side of the house, in the event that a notification needs to go out. That communication is super important. And the more efficiently, more effectively that happens, the easier the whole incident response exercise is going to be. What I see a lot for major breach response, or even a lot of IR testing, which I think this is a good and effective way to do this, is to have a single conference bridge number for the duration of the incident, and have affected parties be able to dial into that bridge and get regular status updates and things like that, just to, again, keep that communication channel open so that people are talking and people know what's going on in their environment. So I'm going to give you an example of when this didn't occur and what the outcome of that was. We were supporting a client on a professional services engagement, and that client had a phishing attack delivered via a user's personal email account via Gmail. And that user clicked on that link in that phishing attack on a organization-owned computer, and the piece of malware was executed. What that piece of malware did was dire, and what that piece of malware did was look at the global address list of that user and then fire off another round of phishing emails to every other user in that person's address list. And in this particular case, that was an address list of 70,000 employees. And so now the email gateway system picked up that this was a problem pretty much immediately, but the organization was not swift enough in acting on sending a communication out to the entire organization, or even alerting the Security Operations Center or the IR staff that something was going on. And so what happened, I suppose it's kind of obvious, is that several other people clicked the link in the subsequent emails, which then generated another round of emails, which then some people clicked the link on, which generated another round of emails, etc. and it found out to over 5,000 machines were compromised with this piece of malware in less than, like, I think 4 or 5 hours. And it had that initial communication email went out that said, hey, there's an incident going on, ignore this email that has this particular message in it. That would have been a good way to contain that incident before it got to the point where it cost literally millions of dollars to fix. Now, you're probably thinking to yourself, well, that's all well and good, but shouldn't my email gateway have caught that? And I think in a lot of cases the answer to that would be yes, but relying upon technology to work 100% of the time is a flawed approach, and you need to be ready to have those communication channels opened as quickly as you possibly can, because the sooner you can get something out that says, hey, everyone, we've got an incident, be on the highest guard, that is going to prevent a small outbreak from becoming a major data breach, and that's really the goal. So keep communications open and keep communicating until and even through that lessons learned phase that we talked about earlier. So in this case, again, the incident response plan would look something like this. We've done prevention. We've identified that there's an incident. We are going to try to execute the containment strategy, which in this case includes network and host level containment in that example that I just gave you. So what maybe we should have done in that case, or the client should have done, is first off, get that communication out there so that everybody knows that there's an incident going on. But then secondly, take some action to block that particular piece of email or something that matches that email signature or things along those lines. That could have happened to contain at the network level. There's also some host-level containment stuff that could have been done to solve the problem. But then eradication moved into literally re-imaging thousands of machines. Unfortunately, in a lot of cases, when you have a bad malware outbreak, you may have to re-image machines in order to get to a known good state. A lot of times, that might just simply be the easier way to go about doing it. Good, well-constructed malware can be really hard to get off of the system, and so it's usually a lot easier just to re-image a box. Hopefully, you've got good gold images that you're able to restore to pretty quickly. If not, you should, and hopefully those gold images have a good secure configuration baseline on them. If not, they should. So once that's all done, you've restored operations. What do you do next? That's where the lessons learned come into play. Again, it's really important to keep communicating even through lessons learned. But lessons learned really is an opportunity for us to ask the question, what can we do better next time? What did we get right during this exercise? What did we get wrong? What can we do to get the wrong stuff right next time, or even make the stuff that we did right that much better? And that's really what we're focused on for lessons learned. Really important to do this during or after every single incident that occurs. It's going to help not only the IR process, but you're also going to learn things that you can be doing better from a security control perspective too. So first off, you need to write an incident report. That incident report is going to detail everything you know about that incident. What occurred at what time, on what machines, what users were involved, what was the chain of events that led up to the incident in the first place, all sorts of stuff like that. And that's going to, that timeline is going to be something that you can, first off, present to a board if you had to give them a rundown of what the incident actually looked like. It's going to also help you identify where the timelines were longer than what they perhaps needed to be, and again, where those efficiencies can be gained by either more practice with the IR plan or by tweaking some of the process, things like that. Of course, you want to identify the root cause of the incident. That's, in my opinion, more important than most other things. I would say it's even more important than eradicating the compromise, but I don't think it's quite at that level, but it's equally as important. So you want to cure the symptoms, but at the same time, you need to make sure that you're curing the disease that's causing the symptoms as well. So those root causes are super important. And usually in my experience, it all does tie back to those 3 security concepts we talked about: the least privilege, least functionality, and need to know. And the root cause is usually something like the concept of least functionality wasn't applied to this SQL server, and so by virtue of that SQL server having an internet browser installed on it, and that user using that to surf the internet led to a compromise of the database that housed our client data, or something like that. And that happens very, very frequently. So that's why it's super important to get those 3 concepts correct. Then, of course, you want to remediate those root causes and solve the root causes. Don't just fix the vulnerability, fix what's causing the vulnerability so that it doesn't happen again. Because there's not much that's worse than telling your board that security incident that we just recovered from and spent a lot of money on recurred, and we had the same thing happen again. You don't want to be in that position. You want to, of course, take a look at what worked well and what didn't work well in the IRP. A lot of times what I see is that there is usually communication breakdowns, and since communication is the most important aspect of it, that's going to be a lesson learned for most people going through this exercise. The more effective you are communicating, the better, and that's going to help make the rest of the process that much more efficient. It's really important then to take what you learned during this exercise and don't just sit on it, but actually bake it into the next version of the IRP, or bake into some new controls that you're going to implement to prevent that problem from recurring. You always want to learn from what you just went through so that it doesn't happen again, or that you're able to do it better next time. That's super important. And again, I recommend that you can use an actual incident as a test case for your IRP, so that if you have to test your IRP maybe once a quarter and you had an incident in Q1, you can count that as your test for the Q1 IRP. But it's useful to update the IRP and then test it again at some future point before the next incident occurs. And it's really got to be a continuous process there of updates and testing and updates and testing. Because the more often you do that, the more practice you're going to have at it, the more of a routine it's going to be when something actually does happen, and the more efficient you're going to be at containing and eradicating problems when they actually do occur. So with that said, that's all the content that I've got to talk about with respect to IRP today. Let's see if we have any questions. Looks like we got a couple. All right, first off, how often does my company need to be testing our IRP? Yeah, that's a good question. Most of the regulations out there require at least annually. Some require quarterly. And like for FSMA, for instance, if you're operating in a FIPS 199 high environment, I believe it's a quarterly requirement at that point to test the IRP. And at a minimum, it's going to be annual. The thing I would say, though, is that if you are working in an organization that has more frequent technology changes than once per year, which almost everyone does, then you should be testing your incident response plan more frequently than once a year. I personally feel like this is something that should be done on a quarterly basis. Most organizations have a requirement to do things like quarterly vulnerability scanning, and you should have like a tabletop exercise for your IRP, I would say at least once per quarter. Probably not much more frequent than that, because then at that point it becomes a bit of a wheel spinning exercise, and people might get conditioned to not participate in those. But at least once a quarter. Okay, the next question, do we really need to have an internal incident response plan if we have an outside company that handles our cybersecurity? So that's a good question. So let's say you've got a managed security services company like TruShield handling 24/7 monitoring for you, and there's some incident response component of that service offering. Do you then still need to have an IRP on your side? And the answer is yes, you do, because there's going to be a handoff. And while you can delegate responsibility for the incident response process to your third party, you can't delegate accountability for it. And at the end of the day, you are going to be held accountable for how well your organization responds to an incident. So yes, you need to have an IRP. That IRP may simply reference your third party organization's IRP, but there's still going to be some handoff of what happens once the job of the third party is done, and I need to kick in on my side doing things like notifications, or even communicating amongst the internal staff. It's likely that your third-party cybersecurity company is not the same organization that's managing your IT infrastructure, for instance. A lot of times you'd have a different entity providing support for that, or you do it internally. And so in the case where you've got to execute containment strategies, or you've got to take a device offline or something like that, that may be something your network operations team does rather than your cybersecurity provider. So at a minimum, your standalone IRP on your side should at least have the communications matrix of who needs to be involved during what type of incident, things like that. And then additionally, your incident response plan is going to reference things like your own insurance policies, your own breach notification requirements, things like that. And all that stuff should be in your documentation. Your third-party provider should certainly be able to contribute to that with their own IRP, and probably has some templates already built for that handoff, or what it looks like when the third party's done their job and needs to hand it back to the client organization. But all that stuff needs to be figured out and in a documented, either at least like a memorandum of understanding, a master services agreement, or preferably a formally defined incident response plan. Good question. Do you have any other questions? Doesn't look like it. Okay, so I guess with that, I'll again thank you all for attending today. This webinar will be up on our website later today, I believe. So feel free to download it from there and point your colleagues and friends to it. Again, I'll invite you, if you have questions, comments, or thoughts about any of the stuff that we've discussed today or cybersecurity in general, please don't hesitate to reach out to me via either email or LinkedIn. You can also visit our website to take a look at some of the resources that we have available for cybersecurity professionals, including threat advisories, threat intelligence reports, other informational webinars, and white papers and things like that. And additionally, if you have any specific questions that you want to bounce off a subject matter expert, feel free to give us a ring at the phone number that's listed there. So again, thank you for your time today, and I'll see you next time.